Hey everyone, so today we are going to be talking about this policy during the Cold War known as containment, and specifically looking at containment when it comes to Asia and how impactful or successful or not successful it was for the United States. So in terms of just looking at the greater policy of containment, really containment was how we dealt with other nations because during the Cold War we were geared towards defeating the Soviets in the Cold War, and more specifically communism and the spread of communism. And so the way that the United States decided to try and defeat uh, this communist overtaking, as the American government saw it, was to put in place this policy in which you would try to, by any means necessary, even war, try to stop the spread of communism. And so that became known as a greater idea of containment. And a lot of this idea was actually driven by a theory that had become popular during the early years of the Cold War, which was the domino theory. And the domino theory said that just like a line of dominoes being set up, if one country fell to communism, then more and more countries would fall around them. And so the fear became, how do we stop it if it starts in a given region or place? And so across the span of the Cold War, a lot of times the United States would start to intervene in countries where they feared that a communist uprising was possible, or it may fall to communism. Because again, we were in this bitter rivalry with the Soviets, and we did not want their ideology of communism to sort of take over. And really, one of the most important events in the early Cold War that led to more of a fear of the spread of communism was the country of China falling to communism. And between 1945 and 1949, there was a revolution within China. During World War II, China was fighting off invasion from the Japanese, who they were simultaneously fighting during World War II. And there was a lot of conflict after that war ended between the Chinese and the Japanese within China over what direction to take as a country. There was a split between those that were nationalists and more likely to be on the side or allied with the United States. And these nationalists were under Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, who were under the leadership of Mao Zedong. And overall, the U.S. Tried to intervene and tried to mediate or tried to find compromise in issues between these two parties. And so this, unfortunately, was unsuccessful, and this led to widespread violence in China. And the communists were able to win military victories over time, and Mao was able to take over China and became the first communist leader in 1949 of what he called the People's Republic of China. And to this day, China is still communist. We are now 75 years after the Chinese Revolution, and the country has continued to stay communist, even though there's been some changes to economic policy and how they've functioned. They were on the side of the Soviets during the Cold War. And looking at Mao Zedong a little bit more carefully here, he was the chairman or the leader of China from 1949 to 1976. He abolished the existing form of government there, which was more of a monarchy type system, a little bit more democratic. And so what he ended up doing was that he changed China in a lot of ways. The first one was confiscating or taking away capital from the Nationalist Party. So anything that they owned, he would sort of take over. But there was also, because the communists believe in shared resources across the country, he ended up leading what he called the Great Leap Forward, in which he had a massive land reform. And unfortunately, the Great Leap Forward in many ways really hurt China, especially in the short term. Approximately 45 million people died from famine and violence that was happening as this sort of took hold. And they also reorganized the national army. They became more of an authoritarian or very much a dictatorship-like government. And so, China was changed in many ways over the course of this communist revolution. Now, another country that soon after China fell to communism was experiencing its own revolution was Korea. And in 1950, the North Korean People's Army, which was a communist sect, they ended up crossing the boundary between the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea to the north and the more pro-Western and pro-democratic Republic of Korea to the south. And so in order to stop another country falling to communism, America ended up entering the war on the side of South Korea. And over the course of 3 years, there was approximately 5 million people that died during the war. And really in a lot of ways, it's almost similar to what we talked about with World War I, it really became sort of a stalemate. And so just like World War I had the Western Front, the Korean War had the 38th parallel, and that's really where the two sides weren't able to gain an advantage. And so more and more people began to die as it sort of became a stalemate over the course of the war. And so the U.S. really viewed this as a war against communism. The North was backed by the Soviets, but at the end of 3 years, the cost was so great that they ended up signing a treaty and an armistice to sort of end the fighting. And so North Korea continued to be communist after that. They are still communist to this day, but also South Korea remained a republic. So more democratic in nature, even though it would be more probably truthful to say anti-communist. So here's a couple pictures from the Korean War, which was a very, very costly war, even though the last slide said it was a forgotten war as well, mostly because it's between two much longer wars in World War II and Vietnam. So the Vietnam War, in many ways, took place from 1955 to 1975. For the first 9 years or so, so from 1955 to 1964, it was more of a sort of stealth mission in a lot of ways. There were a lot of advisors going into Vietnam. But the basic crux of the Vietnam War really surrounded this idea of containment as well. Because you have, very similarly to Korea, in the north you have the pro-communist side, and in the south you have South Vietnam that was attempting to remain pro-Western in many ways. And so they were backed by the United States. And so within this, you have the leader of the North Vietnamese, the leader of the communist sect, and this became a conflict between Ho Chi Minh, who was that leader, and Emperor Bao Dai, who was more inspired by Western ideals. Something that we'll talk about later in this unit is the idea of decolonization. And for many, many years, the Vietnamese were controlled by the French, who ended up leaving in the mid-50s from Vietnam after a revolution had started there. And so a lot of people within Vietnam wanted to move away from the Western ideas, away from these people that had colonized and imperialized their country for so many years. And so the North became again communist. So within South Vietnam, you had the you had a group of fighters who were trying to overthrow the pro-Western government, and these became known as the Viet Cong. These were communist fighters who were trying to create one united Vietnam under the communist banner. And so over the course of time, the United States really saw this country as another country to stop communism from coming to. And so this would lead to war over the course of the 60s and into the 70s. And this became a very, very unpopular war because so many people were dying. So many people viewed it as a fight that we should not be in, even if it was to stop a country from becoming communist. And so over the course of the 60s, a lot of massive protests ended up springing up in America, especially as it became clearer that the war might be unwinnable and that the United States was not doing as well as propaganda that was being shown in the United States was showing us doing. And so over the course of time, again, a lot of people wanted to pull out of Vietnam, and it became a moment in which sort of the ideals of containment were really questioned by a lot of people within American society. And ultimately, at the end of these 20 years, a lot of people unfortunately passed away, and the North Vietnamese ended up taking over South Vietnam and creating one united communist Vietnam. So here's just a couple pictures from some of the fighting and then the protests within Vietnam. A lot of the fighting that happened in the Vietnam War was fought in very dense jungles, very dense rainforests that became very, very hard to sort of see who you were trying to fight. And so a lot of the tactics of the Viet Cong was more guerrilla in nature, where they may be hiding. They dug a lot of tunnels underground in order to, keep the Americans guessing, even though the Americans in many ways had a weapons advantage and had more money and more people. It was very, very difficult to defeat the Vietnamese, especially since they were fighting for what they believed was freedom in their eyes. And so, again, a lot of people started protesting this, as you can see in the bottom right corner in the United States. Now, in terms of conclusions, like we talked about, both wars were fought to, again, contain the spread of communism, both in Korea and in Vietnam. But these did not completely work in terms of keeping communism out of those countries. In North Korea and in Vietnam, we have communist countries even to this day. And so ultimately, a lot of lives and money were spent on these wars, and it often left those in the United States divided to this day about the worth of this policy of containment, and has really, even though in a lot of ways the United States government has continued even after the Cold War to try and contain the spread of what they view as non-democratic, powers, it's really left a lot of people within the United States divided about the nature of war and why we fight these wars in the first place. All right, if you have any questions, please let me know. But other than that, have a great day.